Before we begin, I wanted to add a preface to this video. When I first uploaded this piece, I was very proud of it. It was some great editing paired with a strong and original script, but now the entire thing is a mess. I had no choice but to go in and completely blur out any of the clips that had to do with edgerunners, because for whatever reason, this particular video has been harassed into oblivion with copyright claims. In fact, because of this, I doubt I'm going to cover edgerunners anymore, which is a shame, but I have no choice here given the absolute circus the process of getting this video released has been. The best I can do is mention it in passing. The stress of the situation, and what feels like bullying from two big corpo machines during an already difficult time in my life, has really left me with a bad feeling about creating on YouTube. I've re-uploaded this video countless times by now, and who knows if this iteration will even make it. Every time it passes the checks, someone will actually go in and manually review it to find something new wrong with it. And what I want to know is how they can file a manual copyright claim when the video is private. Is YouTube giving access to companies like Netflix to preview private videos? Or is YouTube simply working for Netflix to find such copyright infringements? Either way, if you're seeing this now, it means it finally made it past the Gestapo after a blanket censoring of all the Edgerunner clips. The quality is not up to my standards though, considering the whole thing is just spliced to hell. But it was all I could do to salvage all the time and effort that I already spent on it. Now, on with the video. Yep, you read that title right. Edgerunners taught me more about cyberpsychosis than the game Cyberpunk 2077 did. You might think it's impossible to miss the huge cyberpsycho influence that's planted all over Night City, especially with Regina's psycho killer side quest, with all of the individual psycho sightings where you're asked to knock them out mercifully. But given the insane amount of quests the game has, it is definitely possible to burn yourself out before ever finishing them all, or to at least not entirely grasp the idea of what's being relayed to you when you do see it. For instance, I remember that one gig, Backs Against the Wall, where you're supposed to retrieve stolen medicine from a veteran soldier. The gig affected me because if you successfully talk him down, he ends up shooting himself as soon as you leave. But if I'm being honest, I didn't really understand what was going on beside the fact that he was discarded and left to fend for himself after serving his time in the military. I didn't know what was wrong with him or why he even needed that medicine. It basically went completely over my head. In fact, I've never played the tabletop game at all, so the first time I played Cyberpunk 2077 was my very first experience with the world, given that I knew nothing about what cyberpsychosis was at all, and I skipped a big portion of Regina's quests where I would have learned more about it because I didn't know how the heck to take them down without killing them. Yeah, sure, I could have looked it up, but there were so many other gigs and side jobs that it's pretty easy to get lost in doing them all. And then before you know it, you've seen all the endings and feel pretty sick of the game, or at least that's how it went for me. But I knew I missed a lot and wanted to go back someday in my second game and try to get closer to 100% completion. So then enters Edgerunners, and at first I'm kind of like, I wonder what this is even gonna be about. Who's gonna be in it? Will it be characters from the game? And so, as many of you did, I watched the show pretty quickly and fell in love with the new characters and the tragic story. And along the way, I realized, wow, I had absolutely no concept of what cyberpsychosis actually was until watching the anime. I didn't even know that it had to do with getting implants, which is pretty bad. But it does make sense because the game mostly acts as though you're an expert and you know everything already. Even when you read the shard about cyberpsychosis, it's just not explained in a way that a noob would understand. For instance, this line specifically in The Truth About Cyberpsychosis says, "Some of us begin to lose sight of what is human. We slip into feelings of total alienation and deep-rooted panic." Well, shit, that's me on any given day. And given that many people in Night City are also on drugs and or heavily dosing on BDs and other digital addictions, these very vague symptoms are not the most telling to people who have no concept of what a cyberpsycho is to begin with. There's no confusing it in Edgerunners, though. They make the details very clear, and even if you don't really know what it means right away when David isn't given the immunoblockers by his Ripper doc, or why it's a big deal that he can use the Sandevistan as much as he did when it drove its previous owner mad, it soon becomes quite clear when we witness Maine's descent into psychosis, though. It starts off simply enough with shaking hands and the occasional staring off into space. Then, in episode 6, we get a look into Maine's mind, too, as he imagines himself as a much younger man with a fully intact human body running in the desert. It's almost as though the body has gone through so much trauma from implants that the brain fantasizes about a time when everything was original. He finally snaps out of it when Dorio prods him by offering food, asking when the last time he ate anything was. His hands are shaking so hard that he drops the food, and Dorio says he has too much chrome and that he should reduce his load as soon as their job is done. He shoots up some more immunoblockers, or at least I'm pretty sure that's what he's taking, but then he suddenly sees David sitting there in the room, but he's sitting outside in the desert, and what's weirdest is that David wasn't even there at all. It was a complete lapse in reality. This understandably causes a break in his mind. It sets him off and he goes full on defensive about how he doesn't need to let go of his chrome, and he even shoves Dorio aside when she tries to get him to chill out. You can see his eyes shifting around at this point too, which is the show's telltale sign of cyberpsychosis. The scene then culminates with Maine punching Kiwi in the face while she's mid-dive, and then there's a blackout where you can hear yelling and punching, but don't know what's happening besides the likelihood that they're all trying to stop Maine's rampage. When Maine finally comes to, you can see Falco holding Kiwi and Dorio just trying to hold herself up against the table. Maine has no idea what's happened. He's completely lost because he doesn't remember doing any of it. Falco gets so pissed off he ends up punching Maine and then quits the team. Lucy and David meet with Maine and Dorio and find out what happened. David doesn't fully understand what Maine losing it even means until Dorio explains it to him that it's cyberpsychosis. Afterwards, David tries to talk to Maine to be a friend to him in his time of need, and Maine acts very uncharacteristic of himself by slapping David with an oversized fist and saying probably every negative thought he'd never actually said out loud before about how David thinks he's hot shit because he's younger than him and faster because of the Sandevistan that was supposed to be Maine's. It's really shitty because it's clear David is just worried about him, but Maine doesn't see it that way. It's like he's changed already at this point. It kind of reminds me of watching an alcoholic who gets really nasty when they drink, and for whatever reason, Maine is completely resistant to the idea of downgrading, as though it will make him less of a runner, even though a dead cyberpunk isn't any good to anyone. So Maine wanders off alone, and we see him in that same desert again, walking now as his current self, and his eyes are freaking out again. In the real world, Dorio finds him facing a wall, and he seems to snap out of it. But of course, right as they're preparing the job, Faraday has to call and exacerbate the situation. He then imagines he sees Faraday in the room, and before long he is on the floor with Dorio giving him another shot of either immunoblockers or whatever it is that seems to stem the tide of the psychosis. When Tanaka flatlines, they're in for a real problem when the jammer doesn't work and lets the signal of his death pass to trauma team. David takes Lucy out of there quickly and waits in the car for them, while Maine and Dorio stay behind to move Tanaka, who they've managed to revive. Things are going well enough as they're leaving, but the NCPD just doesn't stop coming. It's at this point where Maine starts flipping out again. All of the carnage is really setting him over the edge, and you can see his eyes starting to trip out. As Dorio asks him what he's doing and he even tries to shoot at her, he's lost in the desert again and all he can see are shadows of the people around him. The saddest part of this entire scene is that just as Dorio steps in to protect Maine from an onslaught of shots, he snaps out of it again and sees her die before him. And what's worse is that he thinks he might have done it. He has zero recollection of what's happened. It doesn't matter though, because this is when he goes completely psycho and there's no turning back. They call in max tack, but Maine goes on a killing spree in the meantime. David manages to find Maine, but Maine tells him to leave, that it's the end for him. He tells David to get out of there fast before blowing up the funeral pyre of bombs he set Dorio upon. The whole situation is pretty bleak, honestly, but I felt it was important to talk about in detail because it really gives you a better idea of what's happening in Maine's head, about the things that set him off. Now, obviously, David goes through his own cyberpsychosis later on in the series, but David was sort of a special case because he was incredibly resilient to it. That's why Arasaka wanted him in the first place to pilot their secret weapon, the cyberskeleton, which they call an exoskeleton, but all that remains of the pilot is their torso and head. It removes all of the limbs and replaces them with a mechanical suit of sorts. And nobody else could tolerate it and would go instantly crazy. But it's not like I need to explain more about that. The situation with Maine paints a pretty clear picture, and David's experience only makes it picture perfect. Now, this was a concept, cyberpsychosis I mean, that I didn't understand at all prior to watching the show. I had the vaguest idea of what it meant, but I didn't get it entirely. Edgerunners really helped to explain it to me, not just in words, but by actually showing the effects. After finishing Edgerunners for the second time, I started a new Cyberpunk 2077 game, and it was like going into it with completely new eyes. I actually found I had a big interest in cyberpsychosis because now I knew more about it. I found it more intriguing and wanted to see what I had missed the first time through the game when I didn't know what it was. I also decided to equip a pair of gorilla arms because I hadn't tried them yet, and as a bonus, I didn't have to worry about how to put the psychos down without killing them. And I tell you what, it felt like I had been blind, but all of a sudden could now see. There were so many cases of cyberpsychosis throughout the game, and I haven't even finished every single gig yet either, so I'm pretty sure there's going to be more. I did, however, finally finish Regina's quest, but there were other psychos in the game too beside that, like the gig Family Matters with Rosie Morrigan, who I had never encountered before. As you go through the house looking for what happened, you can find evidence that Rosie's sister Julie took her in. There's an illness diary where Julie goes through all of the symptoms, and it becomes clear that even with the pills, Rosie's descent is unstoppable. One of my favorite parts was finding a laptop in Rosie's room with a journal entry from hers truly, and it's incredibly telling. It says, and I quote, "And it soars into me like, 'To the parade, my friend, let's fly, kiss my forehead, lift me up, touch the sky. After all, we can miss it, can we, little sister? Rosie is so thankful. My beloved baby sister won't understand it. No, you only listen to Julie and echo, 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 echo. It says you have to see the parade in Japantown. Without us, the party burns. To the parade, my friends, let's fly, kiss my forehead, lift me up.'" The whole entry sounds completely unhinged, like she's recalling a memory with her sister, and that memory is being corrupted. The interjection of the word echo is like a dead kernel of data that keeps interfering with any rational thought. All the while, the pure memories are further tainted by her negative opinions, bad thoughts she may have harbored about her sister, as well as the mention of a burning party. Her mind is in complete chaos. The whole thing is really interesting, but also sad and messed up. It's almost like having a morbid interest in serial killers because you just want to know what makes them tick, why they do what they do, you know? Cyberpsychosis is sort of the same thing for me, and it's not too far off because, well, most serial killers are psychopaths and have a distinct lack of empathy for their victims. And the word psychosis is used to describe conditions that affect the mind, where there has been some loss of contact with reality. During an episode of psychosis, one's thoughts and perceptions are disturbed, and the person might have difficulty understanding what is real and what is not. Knowing this just served to make me want to be able to define cyberpsychosis more. How exactly does someone become a cyberpsycho? Is it just a matter of adding in upgrades and time? What makes people withstand the implants longer than others? What makes them descend into madness more quickly? Is it how many times they use the equipment, like in Edgerunners? I recall Becca specifically telling David not to use the Sandevistan unless he absolutely needed to at one point. It made me want to look into the sourcebook for some specific information on this topic. So, reading from the Cyberpunk 2020 sourcebook I got with my purchase of the game, it says, something happens when you start adding metal and plastic to people. They start to change, and it isn't pretty. In the 2000s, we call this cyberpsychosis, a mental disease in which the addition of cybernetics causes an already unstable personality to fragment. At first, the victim begins to relate more to machines than to humans. Soon, he starts to ignore people, parents, friends, lovers. Eating, sleeping, all become less important. Finally, human interactions begin to irritate, culminating in a terrifying rage that consumes the victim entirely. All right, so this sounds like a pretty cut and dry description of what we saw Maine go through. We don't know as much about whether he was relating to machines more than humans, but he displayed a lack of interest in eating and definitely raged out pretty hard on multiple occasions. He also seemed to become more violent even when he had it together, given he hit David like 2 different times when he wasn't even blacked out. Now, in the tabletop, it says cyberpsychosis relates to your empathy stat, and each enhancement has a humanity cost. Every upgrade will have a different cost, some being very low while others are high. So for every 10 points of humanity cost, the character loses 1 point of empathy. They use an example that says, if I add 4 new cybernetic devices for a total humanity cost of 36, I will lose 3 points of empathy. They go on to describe what a character with 3 empathy might be like, saying they'd be cold and emotionless. Someone with an empathy stat of 2 would be distinctly unpleasant to others. A score of 1 empathy would be a violent sociopath who would constantly fight to keep themselves from going over the edge and committing irrational acts of murder and mayhem. At an empathy rating of 0 or less, the character is full in the grip of cyberpsychosis, driven by a hatred of other humans or living things. There is no turning back, and at this point, the referee, basically the DM in Cyberpunk, takes control of the character. It does add at the end that not all cyberpsychos are the rampaging type. Many exhibit subtle symptoms: compulsive lying, kleptomania, sadism, brutality, split personality, and extremely violent mood swings. It's great to be able to grasp the concept from the game, though, because it tells us that the disease itself revolves around empathy. In the game, the empathy stat is described as how well you relate to other living things, a measure of charisma and sympathetic emotions. In a world of alienated, future-shocked survivors, the ability to be human can no longer be taken for granted. Empathy is critical when leading, convincing, seducing, or perceiving emotional undercurrents. Empathy is also a measure of how close he or she is to the line between feeling human being and a cold-blooded cyber monster. In the real world, to me, empathy has always meant having the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and actually feel what it might have been like to go through any number of bad situations. Sometimes it's just being able to know ahead of time how someone might respond and being considerate of them. So if someone needed a pretty high empathy score in order to get a ton of implants without any major problems, it is probably safe to say that, at least by the tabletop standards, that who you are to begin with as a person plays a big factor. You'd have to be pretty dang empathetic and compassionate. And it's also interesting to note that I think David really falls into this category too. He is young and naive, but he's also incredibly sincere and seems to genuinely care about his friends. Now, getting back to what I was saying though, once you get too many upgrades and you have no empathy left, well then you're screwed. You're cyberpsycho. How this would translate to the quote-unquote real cyberpunk world when you view it as such from the game or the anime could just be a special sweet spot, and once you get too many enhancements, you're done for. But it seems they've also added in other unspoken elements. For instance, why is that guy Jimmy Kurosaki, the Braindance editor who did the original Edgerunner BDs in the anime, when he kidnaps David, he says he can push him into cyberpsychosis just by making him watch himself get killed by Max Tech over and over again in these BDs. It makes it hard to get an idea of what exactly pushes people over the edge, because in the tabletop it seems pretty clear cut. It seems they're going for something less tangible and more abstract for the game and show, though. There's also the very strange fact that V doesn't ever have to worry about suffering from cyberpsychosis in the game, and you can add upgrade upon upgrade without any consequences whatsoever. I've heard some people say it's because of the relic, or because the devs didn't have the time to add that kind of a system into the game. Whatever the reason, I think it's strange to have the idea of cyberpsychosis so prevalent, and yet it never affects the main character. I think it only serves to confuse people like me who were new to the franchise. I mean, there's a real disconnect when you can put just about any upgrade on your character and still be perfectly fine, all while others are doing the same thing and they're going cyberpsycho. It just left me kind of confused and feeling like it was a topic I didn't really understand. Even now that I do comprehend it more, even reading it straight from the source book, it's still confusing how it's portrayed sometimes. But even so, if not for Edgerunners, I would still be sitting here having zero clue what the heck cyberpsychosis was all about. How about you guys? Did the show help you to better understand the illness? Or were you already playing the tabletop and felt that the new concepts introduced just confused things even more? Either way, I guess there's always room for interpretation when it comes to writers taking the information and running with it. I think it's really a cool concept, but won't deny I wouldn't mind having a firmer grasp as to how cyberpsychosis affects characters that are more alive than, let's say, the straight math of the tabletop game. I thought I might also mention that there is a mod called Wannabe Edgerunner that adds a simple cyberpsychosis function to the game. It adds in a humanity cost for cyberware implants as it would be in the tabletop, as well as some low humanity side effects like visual glitches, and eventually progresses into full-on cyberpsychosis. They even added neural blockers to the game, which can halt the effects. I haven't tested it out yet myself, but it's available and sounds pretty interesting compared to the current situation in the game. I'll leave the link down below in the description for anyone who wants to try it out. I've also been really blown away by all the new people on my channel watching the Edgerunners video I did about the great female characters in the anime, and even some new hits to some of my old Cyberpunk content. I hope you guys enjoy this one too, and I've got some more ideas in the works as well for new stuff. Let me also give a big thank you to my Patreons. Thank you so much for your support. It really helps keep this channel running. And if you'd like to support the continued creation of my content too, head on over to my Patreon, where you can pledge whatever amount you feel it's worth to you and get access to a lot of great stuff like personal updates, Patreon-only videos, my writings, and art too. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, perhaps leave a comment, since all of that junk helps the algorithm to acknowledge my channel's worth. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys later.